Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest, who has a PhD in English Literature and Cultural Studies, is the author of the literary novel Whiskey River, which is set in the high desert of eastern Washington state. His name is Jeffrey Dunn, and my interview with Jeffrey will follow the note-taking sounds. Jeffrey Dunn, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Good to be here. Good to be here, Aaron.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, I'm Jeffrey Dunn, and I've been writing since I'm about 14. I'm 67. Grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but moved to the Northwest, Washington State 30 years ago with my wife and children. English teacher, PhD in English literature and culture studies, but always taught high school. So high school and especially developmental reading, that was kind of my jam. But I've always been writing. And so when I retired, I could get even more serious. And 5 books later, here I am talking to you.
Without spoiling too much of your literary fiction novel, Whiskey Rebel, which you had published in May of this year, what is it about?
Well, let's see. Whiskey Rebel is about 2 young men, and they come together and decide that they're going to make tax-free whiskey like one of the main characters 4 generations ago in Pennsylvania, in Western Pennsylvania, when we had our first rebellion in 1794 against the United States. We've been rebelling against our government for forever, not just the Civil War, not just now. It's always been going on, and these guys don't want to use bombs and they don't want to use guns, but they do want to make tax-free whiskey. And then it's all of the quirky characters that they draw to themselves as they're on this quest to learn more about what American freedom is.
The setting of Whiskey Rebel is the high desert region in eastern Washington state. How does the setting of your book play an integral part of the story?
Well, I call myself a writer, a fiction writer of place, and place is everything. So in all of my books, place is a big deal, and this one, Central Washington, is near where I live in Eastern Washington, and I just start with the natural history, the human history, spend a lot of time on Google Maps, drive around. My wife spent time in Moses Coulee, which is where this novel takes place specifically, near Wenatchee, Washington. And so it's a place where you can get lost. It's a place where you can imagine making whiskey and nobody knows what's going on. It's a place where you could fence it. It's a place, where you can get lost. And these guys, can do that. And the other characters who are very much singular characters, the sorts of people that I've been living amongst the last 30 years who are living in this area because they can be what they want to be. And they don't have a lot of social pressures. And and there you go. So it's all about that place. It is underlying it was all the basalt from the Grand Ronde volcano, the Wanapum volcano vents, and then there was this huge flood, the Missoula floods, which was a lake that went all the way from Idaho into Montana, about half the size of Lake Michigan. And it cut loose various times because the glaciers would come down and block the area, and then they'd cut loose, and then they'd come down again, and it went over and over, and it washed all the soil off. So the weed all grows on top, and down at the bottom is all this basalt, which is like the moon. And so I just thought that was a really striking, interesting place for these characters to operate.
For our listeners that are not familiar with the Pacific Northwest, once you get east of the Cascades in Washington and Oregon, it is very dry and in a rain-shadowed area east of the Cascades.
Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, we're one of the reasons I love our state is we have microclimates is a favorite word. So you can go everywhere from high desert to the only rainforests in the contiguous 48, and everything in between, from the Palouse, which is all wheat farms and lentil farms and peas, to all the dry land wheat farming, to sagebrush and tumbleweeds, then the Cascades, and the bitter roots are all the way out to the west. So we have more than one mountain range too. We cover a lot of, there's something for everybody. Let's put it that way.
Two of the characters in Whiskey Revel are Punxsy Tawny and Hamilton Chance. What was the inspiration behind those two characters?
Yeah, they're they're interesting guys. I started off very much as just kind of a picaresque buddy novel with this whiskey idea, and then bring in this. They end up in Wenatchee in the library researching, so we get to learn all about the Whiskey Rebellion, and they Hamilton discovers, and so does Punksy. Um, but and I wanted names that somehow felt Revolutionary War era. So Hamilton and Chance, those are all like Alexander Hamilton, and Chance kind of threw the whole Las Vegas gambling thing in there, and then Punxsutawney is a town in Pennsylvania, and Tawny is a last name, so I figured to split it in half and give him that first name and last name. Thought that was different, unique. He says, "Yeah, my parents didn't like me very much. They gave you that name." Um, and then I as I went back and did rewrites, I developed a lot of backstory. So Punksy's a shell-shocked Iraqi war veteran, and then Hamilton, I just deepen that character, but I add a lot about he's actually from the wet side of the state, and he's come to the trying to figure out what anything means after he's come back with his brain rattled from an IED explosion, what he wants to do with his life and what freedom means, because it's not what he expected in Iraq. So these two guys bump into each other, and because they can't figure out what else to do, they chase Hamilton's dream of making tax-free whiskey.
What role does research play in writing a literary fiction novel for you?
For me, I when I'm writing, I because we use computers nowadays and we have the internet, I start to write, and then I get ideas. There's always human history involved, and there's always, what are the plants, what are the animals, what's the weather, so forth and so on. What's the geology? And then I just start researching, and the more I know, the more I feed my imagination, the more my imagination can kind of sculpt that in different ways. Just take it and run. I don't have a plan when I write. I have a place and I have a couple of characters and kind of a notion of the direction they're going to go when they meet. And then from there it just takes off, and the characters lead the way, and then I research as I go. So research, yeah, research is a big thing. What's the history of Wenatchee? What's the history of Moses Cooley? What's the history of the Columbia River? The tribe. One of the characters is Native American, and what's the tribal history? And Chief Moses shows up in dreams, and there's all kinds of stuff going on, that all comes from the research. And my purpose is to deepen the novel, and reviewers, excuse me, reviewers say I've accomplished that, so I'm happy about it.
How long did it take you to write Whiskey Rebel from start to finish?
Right. I would say that just the first draft about a year, and then once I got hooked up with the publisher and worked with a developmental editor. By the way, the same person who was a developmental editor for Netflix's Bridgerton. So she was a trip. She was an awful lot of fun. She was in Taiwan. She's from Brooklyn, but she was in Taiwan when we were trading, um, back and forth, readings and comments and all that kind of stuff. Um, yeah, and then probably another year then in the process of going through rewrites. One I did beforehand before I handed it to her, so I'd been through two, one rewrite, and then I rewrote it a second time. It was a very different book when it was finished. The first time was a major reorganization. The second time was a whole lot of adding depth to what goes on, so we know what motivates the characters. So they become, instead of just zany, they become people psychologically that you understand and maybe even like a little bit.
What were the easiest and hardest parts of writing a literary fiction novel for you?
That's the first time anyone's ever asked me that. Um, what's what's easy is just it's what I do. My brain is always doing this, and so even when I mean, I've always been writing something for the last 50 years, and most of it ended up in a drawer. But writing poetry, writing short stories, writing this, writing that, and so just writing drafts, the writing, the characters, all that sort of thing. I don't find that difficult. That's a pleasure. That's fun. That's like breathing. That's like having dinner. What's hard is when that's all done, you have an audience and you have readers. And going back, and I've gotten much better about revising, taking all of that. It's kind of like I create the marble, so to speak, but then I have to be Michelangelo. I've got to be Da Vinci. I got to be whoever, and I got to sit down and craft it in such a way that the audience is going to respond, and I have some control over what that is. And that's what I've my developmental editors have helped me with a lot, so that now a lot of it's hardwired. So I kind of do it from the beginning with the new novel I'm working on. Um, so it's really that sort of thing. Getting it ready, to put in a book that's going to review well. And I've got a good publisher for that, so that's been great.
Is Whiskey Rebel independently, traditionally, or hybrid published?
Ah, very good. I see that you not too long ago worked with a company or with a gentleman who helps people self-publish. That's a lot of interest to me. So this is Whiskey Rebels hybrid published. I published a book of short stories and a book of poetry first, just flat out self-published the whole, sitting down, working with Ingram Spark and getting all of that together and learning how to code all those things and get ebooks, and that's a whole different ball game. But then that's very limited in terms of doing that. So I sent it out to some publishers, and I just went lots of different places. And Tim McConaughey of Izzard Inc. Was interested. I've been very blessed because, not surprisingly, there are sharks in the world. There are folks who would love to have your money. They promise big things and they deliver much less. Tim's been wonderful. So it's hybrid publishing is that pay as you go thing, and he has all the connections for people who do beautiful. I can make a cover, but I can't make the cover like Andrea Ho did for Whiskey Rebel, or did for Wildcat, or did for Radio Free Olympia. I can do the interior design, but I can't do it like Daniel Langan did for those three books. In terms of developmental editing, the people that I've worked with who simply act as a reader and then feed me back questions. Do you intend this? Reader may want to know more about this. This seems extraneous. Those kinds of things. They don't tell you what to write. You can always say no, but they just give you they're that extra ear, because what you intended and what readers may pick up can be two different things. And so to have somebody who's really studied, who's really good, and Tim knows good people too. So that whole hybrid publishing thing has been a blessing, but you need a bank account. That's just a fact. To get from what is self-published quality to something that competes with anything that comes out of and in fact can be better than your traditional published house. Because what I found is a lot of really talented people have left traditional publishing. It's too restrictive and it doesn't pay enough, and they've gone out and they freelance now, and they can do better freelancing. They have more freedom. They do better work, and I've been able to work with some of those people. I've been very blessed, very blessed.
You mentioned you've written a few works of fiction, including a poetry collection and a couple of other stories. Other than Whiskey Rebel, and without spoiling too much about your other written works of fiction, what are some of your other works of fiction that you've written called, and what are they about?
Sure. Um, Last year I published Wildcat, an Appalachian romance, and it's my thought experiment. I grew up in the Rust Belt area of Appalachia near Pittsburgh. And my thought experiment is what would happen if I went home and decided to retire, down in the little community down there where there's a steel mill and there used to be a mine, a steel mine, or the Allegheny River, and there used to be a coal mine. And I went to school with a lot of those kids. And what would that be like? And how could I make that not only, dramatic as a memoir, fictional memoir going home, not me, the character isn't me, it's a fictional memoir. Um, but how can I allow that place to be more magical and not be just your downer sort of Appalachian novel where like our vice president, didn't have a whole lot good to say about the Appalachia where he grew up. Well, I wanted this novel to do better than that and to show the possibilities of what the future could lie. So that's a kind of magical little easy read book. And the big one is Radio Free Olympia that takes place in the rainforest, essentially, on the Olympic Peninsula, right on the Washington coast. And it's a Joycean thing with lots of voices. It's the boiling it all down. It's all the odd chapters are a young man with a pirate radio transmitter who hikes into the Olympics and mountains and transmits the spirits and the dead of the Olympic mountains. And then for the even number chapters are a poetry journal kept by a woman named Bay, who's inherited her cranberry farm from her parents who've passed away. And she starts a all women's roadhouse called Wild Sisters and kind of treats it as a convent for broken women, although it's not religious in that sense. She's very, we'll call it a feral Christian, so to speak. But of course, she picks up his signal coming out of the mountains down to her cranberry farm, and there's the novel. You got to get them together, along with lots of other voices in the novel. My intention was to allow that to speak, and that's my model for what I'm working on now for the Spokane area. Something much more expansive, much more magical. Wildcat is on the magical realism scale is much more realistic than magical. Well, Radio Free Olympia is much more magical, and that's what I'm leaning into right now. About 20 pages into another one of those magical longer works.
Do you have a typical writing routine, a typical writing process, or both? And if so, what is that, or are those like for you?
Yes. Ideally, when life doesn't intervene, I'd get up in the morning, and it takes me a while. I've always been slow to wake up. Get my coffee, get settled or whatever, and I read. I usually have 4 or 5 books, and usually a piece of nonfiction, a piece of fiction, some poetry. I've been reading Rick Rubin's The Creative Act now, and I had a Brian Eno book, which is on creativity, which is really interesting. And I read a few pages from each. I get easily bored, so I just go back and forth and try and feed my mind with as much interesting words as possible. And then I sit down, and if I'm starting from scratch, I try and write about 200 to 300 words. And then I quit, and then I come back the next day and start the same way with those books. And I read those 200 words, 300 words, and revise and then try and write 200 to 300 more. And then come back and start that process again and read what is now 400 to 600 words and try and add 200 to 300 more. Always revising, keeping in mind what I've written previously until I get 10 pages in or so. And then I can leave some of those early pages behind and then just continue that way and see where it goes.
You've written essays on Medium, which is a blogging site. What
Right.
topics do you write essays on Medium about?
Yeah, I'm on Medium and Substack too as Culture Raven, my own little name there. But on both of those places, I write a good bit about of I was a radio DJ and music director when I was in college, and have a PhD in culture studies. So things that are in culture that I think I have something interesting to say that doesn't sound like what somebody else has has read. Just finished a piece on AI and our diets and how they might have something to say to one another. Um, Ultra processed foods and AI and kind of connections there. Sinead O'Connor, things I wrote about. What else is in there? I did a whole bunch of stuff on what I'm calling feral Christianity, which is folks who don't go to church, um, but have this Christian upbringing and are trying to do something with it uh, that doesn't match what the history of church has been maybe the last 2,000 years, which seems to me often not have a whole lot to do with what's in the Gospels. Uh, yeah, and some things on writing, just on creative process, and I do some things on creative process because an awful lot of things written on these sites right now that are about writing tend to be very programmatic, tend to be 10 ways to do this or 5 ways to do this or whatever, and since obviously my process doesn't look anything like that, there's got to be other people like that out there for me, and I'm just trying to loosen it up a little bit and give people some room to breathe and be themselves. And then, because on Medium and Substack, you can just publish. I mean, you don't need that. That's some place you can go build an audience, and you don't need to sink a whole lot of cash into that.
One final question. How has your PhD in English literature and cultural studies helped you as an author and writer?
A blessing and a curse is what I would say. So I will start. I'll start with the curse. The curse is that when you work at that high level, beyond your master's degree into, working at a graduate level and a PhD, you have to create something. You have to research and study and create something that apparently no one has ever done in the history of mankind. Good luck with that. Mine dealt with William Burroughs, T.S. Eliot, and modernism. Um, you develop your brain becomes wired for a certain way of talking, the certain way of writing, and it took me years to jettison that, to make that go away, because that's not fiction writing, that's not poetry, that's its own thing, but it's not that. And I just needed to figure out how to flush that, which it took me the death of my older son to really flush it good. But the blessing is that it really deepens uh, your language abilities. It deepens the scope of how you think. It transforms your brain in a way, and you just become so much more literate and so much more capable. Since I do lots of research, and you don't need a research library anymore, that you can use those skills to inform your creativity, to support it, as opposed to, stick it in a cage. Once you learn to keep the cage door open, it's all good. And so it was a lovely time when I did it, and I would do it again. I was very blessed to do it, and blessed to do it in such a way that it was the program that I went through was a kind of an experimental program. It didn't even have a department called a culture studies department, and they were kind of making up go as they went along, and I was a guinea pig, and I like being a guinea pig. So we kind of made the program up, and they kind of tested it on me, and I earned my PhD, so I guess I passed. I guess I did okay. I didn't die. I didn't die in the laboratory.
Jeffrey, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. You were an insightful guest.
Well, I was me, and thank you, Aaron, for giving me this opportunity. It's always a good time to bounce some ideas back and forth with folks.
A literary fiction novel set in the inland Northwest sounds like a very interesting read. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2025, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.